So let's continue learning a little bit about the AI standard surface material and how we can actually edit it. Now what I did was I've assigned an AI standard surface material to each one of these objects. So this is matte sphere. The cone will have matte underscore cone, matte underscore torus for my little ring, and matte underscore floor for the little disc that is sitting at the bottom. With 4 different materials going in, I also rendered this out. It's taking me about 33 seconds to render something like this. It's a little blown up right now, and there's also a significant amount of noise in here. Let's just bear with this noise for now while we're dealing with materials, and we'll fix this noise when we go into um, um, lights, perhaps. Okay, so since this is what our render looks like, I'm going to show you how to save this render. All you have to do is click on this little icon which is store a snapshot, and that allows me to not only store a snapshot like this, I can click on the snapshot and I can take notes like just assigned basic AI standard surface materials to all the objects. So that's great. Click on the outside or click. So you see that while this little button is highlighted, you kind of have selected your snapshot number 1. Click on it again. So you're now basically uh, working the scene. So let's just continue um, exploring our AI standard surface. Now start with the sphere. You'll see that when I go into the attribute editor, I've got a bunch of tabs in here. I've got base, specular, transmission, subsurface, code, emission, thin, blah, 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 blah. There are so many of these. Um, I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously. I'm actually not even going to explore uh, all the parameters of each one of these tabs, or at least the tabs that I'm going to explore. I'm going to touch upon some basic parameters to give you guys an idea of how Arnold works. So let's start with base. In this video, basically, I'm going to be covering base and specular. So let's not talk about specular right now. Right now, let's just speak about base. Um, you'll see that there are 2 tabs in here. There's color and there's weight. So let's discuss those. Color is simply the color. So if I set it to blue, we have this sharp blue going on with my sphere. The way I want you to understand the weight parameter is it's 0.8 times, which is 80% of the blue. That's one way to think about it. So as I start dropping this from 0.8 towards 0, you'll see that my blue becomes darker and darker and darker and darker. If I go all the way to 0, this is 0% of the blue, which is black, and that's why my sphere is appearing to be completely black. Okay, if I go all the way to 1, this is going to be the brightest blue that you're going to see. Now by default, this value is set to 0.8, so I'm just going to set it to 0.8. I'm going to try and render this out just to show you what it looks like. So let's just render the whole thing out. It's going to take us about 30 or so seconds. Now I'm going to use the play button here instead, and I want you to see what happens. So remember, I'm in my play mode. It's rendering right now, but what it's also doing is constantly listening to the changes that I'm making to the parameters. So if I change the parameter right now to say something like red, it'll automatically re-render the scene. Now this is great if you're making small tweaks, if you're trying to work the weight a little bit. You see, going all the way down to 0, going all the way up to 1. So it kind of allows me to preview the things that I'm doing here. Set that to 0.8. This process obviously is time consuming, and it's also process heavy. So it should be used only when you're tweaking the materials, not setting your materials in the beginning. One way to expedite this is to you can stop the render at any time by clicking on stop. You can click on crop region, which means you actually get to select a region and then press play, and that way it's not rendering the entire thing, it's basically just limiting itself to that particular area, which is great, cuts down on the process. I'm going to increase my diffuse roughness just for you guys to see what happens, but before that I'm going to save a snapshot and then go up on my diffuse surface. Just waiting for it to render the sphere. And if you actually check the differences between the two, what the diffuse roughness parameter does is it kind of gives um, this effect to the surface where it feels like the light falling on it is kind of it's being diffused, it's been scattered a little bit, and the material is slightly more grainier, if you will. So that's really what it does. um, I won't go into the details of it because what's coming up after this is really the more interesting part. Let's get out of the preview mode. So we are now working the scene. Let's bring our diffuse roughness back to 0. But metalness is really one of the most interesting things here. It's a completely new parameter, and I want you to see how it really works. Now, if you actually look at the reflection here, the reflection, and of course there are no reflections on this side of the sphere because there aren't any objects in here, so I'm just going to be focusing on this area right here. You see that it's reflecting the torus. I'm going to increase my metalness, and I want you to see what happens to that reflection. You see that this reflection not only becomes more emphasized, but it also becomes so that the ball looks like it's made out of chrome material. And that's really what they're calling metalness. You can also see that as my metalness has gone up, my diffuse roughness has pretty much gotten grayed out, which means any given material in normal cannot be 100% metal-like and be rough and grainy. I mean, there are ways to do it through bump mapping and all that, but you can't certainly do it through this particular tab. So if you're trying to make objects that are chrome-like, then metalness is the property that you want to work. It's very interesting. I'm going to save a snapshot, bring my metalness down back to 0, and I'm also going to, let's see if I can change, you know what, let's keep the color. I'm just going to switch this off, and let's render a whole region. While this is rendering, let me tell you that if you have color maps that you need to assign, those are going to go into your color tab right here. This is where your textures will get attached. Meanwhile, if you're looking to plant your um, bump maps, your bump maps are going to go into this tab called as geometry. Right here you have bump mapping, and once you click on it, then the operation of it is going to be very similar to Lamberts and Blends and all those materials that we had. So this is where your bump maps go. It's in this tab called as geometry. I'm going to go back to specular because that's what this video is about discussing the base tab and the specular tab. Now once again, right now your specular color is set to white. It means that the reflections, the shine that you're about to get, the specular highlights rather that you're about to get are fairly true. Now if I actually cut the weight down from 1 all the way to just, yeah, something like that. Let me bring the weight down all the way to 0. Oh, like so. I'm going to save this file as we go. I'm going to just press play, and I want you to see how matte and flat this object becomes. There you go. Which means that my specular weight has been brought down to 0. It means There's no specularity whatsoever, so this object is perfectly matte at this point. It's nice. I'm gonna have my IPR switched on so I can make changes. I can increase the specularity, and you see that the shine comes in. And Arnold, the shine of the object, which is the specularity, is kind of tied into the reflectivity. And this was not so with blinds and forms that we have operated on before. So remember, the shinier the object, the more reflectivity it's going to get. And you want this to look like a mirror, you're going to have to operate the metalness parameter. Okay, I'm going to very slowly increase the roughness on the specularity, and you should be able to see what you get is the object once again becomes very matte. Now let me not bring the roughness all the way up, I'll bring it just a tad bit up so you're able to see what's happening. You can see the specularity in itself becomes a little grainier and grainier. I'll let this render out. Maybe a tad bit more. So once again, it gives the illusion that the object is a little rough in a way. I don't know if you guys can see that here. I can certainly see it. The specularity is becoming fuzzier and fuzzier to the point where it just simply disappears. I'm not going to be discussing index of refraction and the other two parameters in this video, so I'm going to stop right here.